At the end of 2009, gamers across the world were enjoying the season's top hits. The PlayStation 3 and PSP were finally firing on all cylinders. The Xbox 360 was getting classic game after classic game, and Nintendo was enjoying unprecedented success with their 1-2 combo of the Nintendo DS and the Nintendo Wii. Pokémon was the golden goose to Nintendo's success throughout the past decade. Pokemania revived the aging Game Boy, and the spin-offs on the Nintendo 64 helped drive sales throughout the latter half of the system's life. Pokémon was the best-selling game on the Game Boy Advance, and spin-offs on the Nintendo GameCube gave fans the console adventure they long begged for. The success of Diamond and Pearl on the Nintendo DS reversed the trend of declining sales in the franchise. Pokémon Platinum, the third version of Diamond and Pearl, was released to great critical acclaim as the culmination of years of improvements to the Pocket Monsters formula. In Japan, trainers were already enjoying the latest release in the series. Pokémon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, remakes of the Game Boy classics, graced the Nintendo DS in the early fall. Western gamers were eagerly awaiting the release, scheduled for the spring of next year. As snowflakes melted on the chimney's fire, no one could have expected what the next decade was going to be like for gaming, let alone the future of everyone's favorite creature collector. What they didn't know was that Game Freak was hard at work creating an entire new generation of Pokémon games, ones that would push the Nintendo DS to its limits and weave together a tale that gamers still consider one of the best stories to ever appear in the Pokémon series. This is the story of Pokémon Black and White. Part 1. A new world with never-before-seen Pokémon. By the end of the 2000s, Game Freak was a powerhouse of a developer. With the release of Pokémon Platinum in Japan in late 2008, it brought an end to the adventures in Sinnoh, and preparations began for creating a new generation of Pokémon. A small portion of the staff at Game Freak broke away from the main development team, with their focus being the remakes of Pokémon Gold and Silver. The rest of the Pokémon development team was under the leadership of series' longtime composer and director, Junichi Masuda. Unlike past generations, however, Masuda would approach this new set of games with a more detailed plan and a shortened development time. The Nintendo DS, already on the market for half a decade, was approaching the end of its life cycle. To hasten development, Masuda approached the team with a 200-page comprehensive document outlining in detail all of the new features they were going to include in the new games. These new Pokémon games were to be built around creating experiences that touched on the connections between Pokémon, the characters of the world, and the player themselves. The team was keen on making these new games a unique experience. Common complaints about the series at the time revolved around the similarities between each entry, and how the latest games still followed the same design tropes employed by the Game Boy games. Exacerbating the problem was the system of choice for these new Pokémon games. In the past, a new set of Pokémon games were introduced alongside new hardware. This gave developers plenty of tools to make each Pokémon game feel different from the last. The increased graphical resolution and improved musical scores were more than enough for some. But for these new games, they would be released on the same hardware as the previous generation. Game Freak's decision to develop the games on the Nintendo DS came from multiple reasons. Launching all the way back in 2004, the Nintendo DS had a deep player base that was only rivaled by the likes of the PlayStation 2. Nintendo's next handheld was still a few years away as well. Developers weren't starting from scratch either, as a plethora of ideas and improvements left on the cutting room floor from previous generations were revisited. One of these features was being able to connect your Pokémon games to the computer via a wireless internet connection for additional rewards, Pokémon, and even tournaments. Local wireless play was also an early focal point. Game Freak had been expanding the local multiplayer options in the series, and wanted to go even further by increasing the amount of players possible during multiplayer. These features would slowly evolve into the C Gear, an in-game item that takes up most of the bottom screen on the Nintendo DS during overworld gameplay. Before launch, the team ultimately scrapped the idea of using a mass wireless connection between devices due to how quickly the feature drained the DS's battery. Instead, developers opted to build infrared technology into each cartridge, allowing the games to communicate directly without using the Nintendo DS's wireless features. On the creative side of things, Ken Sugimori once again returned. By this stage, Sugimori wasn't creating as many new Pokémon characters. Instead, he led a small team of artists and designers who designed the new Pokémon. In his role as 2D art director and director of Pokémon characters, Sugimori made final adjustments to the designs to help give each one that distinct Pokémon style. And they would have their work cut out for them, as these new Pokémon games would feature more than 150 new monsters, the most introduced since the series' origins. In early 2010, hints of new Pokémon games were already starting to crop up. The Pokémon movies and anime were well known for teasing new Pokémon before they made their in-game debut, and Generation 5 would be no different. Pokémon Sunday, a variety show that aired in Japan at the time, was the first to tease new information on the games. In February 2010, they showed a silhouette of a never-before-seen Pokémon that was set to star in the upcoming Pokémon movie. The on-screen host encouraged viewers to come back next week for the official reveal, but they wouldn't have to wait long. Later that week, CoroCoro, a magazine dedicated to Pokémon, leaked both the new Pokémon and its pre-evolution. Information on the games was kept to a minimum at the time, but fans were left with some good news. These new Pokémon titles were scheduled for release in Japan later that year. New information about the games didn't come out until April, after the international release of Pokémon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. In-game images were revealed in CoroCoro, revealing a dynamic camera, impressive new graphics, and official names. Harkening back to the series' roots, these new games were named after colors, black and white. Information began to pour out following the official title reveal. In May, the official Pokémon website revealed the cover monsters for the new games. The new starter Pokémon and player characters were revealed in CoroCoro that same month. Over the coming months, CoroCoro revealed several new Pokémon and dropped new in-game screenshots to drum up hype in Japan. With the game's fast approaching release, Junichi Masuda made one final, notable announcement in August. Pokémon Black and White would only feature brand new Pokémon during the game's main adventure. The region's wide variety of Pokémon was another nod to the series' roots, as 156 new Pokémon were designed for the games. This number not only surpassed the original generation in terms of new Pokémon, but is also the largest group of additions in the series' history. On September 18, 2010, Pokémon Black and White were released in Japan. Critical reception for the titles was exceptional, with Famitsu awarding the games a perfect 40 out of 40 score. Commercial sales were unprecedented. Within 1 week, the game sold a combined total of 2.5 million copies in Japan. This still stands as the record in the region for a game not released on digital marketplaces. Sales didn't stop either. By the end of January, the title sold 5 million copies, all before the international release. The games were so popular that some Western gamers opted to import the titles or play the games through less legal means with fan-made translations. In December 2010, Pokémon Black and White were given official release dates for the rest of the world. To promote this, the Pokémon Company International announced a tour in January. At select malls across the United States and Canada, the Pokémon Black and White sampling tour gave trainers a chance to try out the latest games in the series before they were released. The multi-week tour also featured screenings of the latest Pokémon movie, exclusive merchandise usually reserved for Japanese Pokémon centers, and the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to meet life-size versions of the new starter Pokémon from Black and White. In February, just a month before launch, Nintendo revealed a new Nintendo DSi bundle that would launch alongside the games. The bundle released on the same day as Pokémon Black and White, with each version of the game receiving a different Nintendo DSi. The Pokémon Black bundle featured the game, a Nintendo DS carrying case, and a limited edition Black DSi. The Pokémon White version bundle featured the same, although it came with a white Nintendo DS. The front of these special DSi's featured outlines of the new box legendaries, and the title of the game. In March 2011, Pokémon Black and White released across North America, Europe, and Australia. Western reception was met with solid review scores from critics, with a lot of praise being given to the game's mature storyline and decision to only include new Pokémon for the main story mode. Fans ate up the games as well. Praise was centered on the game's crisp graphics and speedy gameplay when compared to past DS entries. On the first day alone, Pokémon Black and White sold 1 million copies in the United States. Within 2 weeks, it sold another million. By the end of April, Pokémon Black and White sold a worldwide total of over 11 million units. Pokémon Black and White start off no different than any other Pokémon games. After a brief introduction to the world from the Pokémon Professor, the player is given a starter Pokémon, corresponding to the types of grass, fire, and water. After a few tutorials, you're set off on a journey to collect 8 badges, and catch as many Pokemon as you can across the Unova region. However, the story takes a unique spin upon reaching Accumula Town, the second town in the game. After entering the quiet suburb, the player is met with Team Plasma and their leaders, Getsus, and the king of Team Plasma, N. While past villainous teams wish to control Pokemon for a variety of self-serving objectives, Team Plasma wants to liberate Pokemon from the ownership of all trainers. Spurred by Getsus and endorsed by N, Team Plasma sets out to stop anyone other than themselves from having Pokemon. This unique story dynamic would play throughout the adventure, with characters from both sides of the conflict questioning the ethics of Pokemon ownership, and if the creatures we had grown close to over the past decade and a half were consenting combatants to our battles. The story wasn't the only aspect that received an upgrade. Several new wireless features were introduced with the C Gear. When turned on, it gives you quick access to Wi-Fi and local wireless connections. Of these, Interlink was the most notable. Located at the center of the Unovan map, Interlink allows players to connect with one another and explore the Unova region together. It also gives you access to the Pokemon Dream World, an internet browser-based game that worked to deliver items and Pokemon to your game. This was the only way to unlock Pokemon with rare, hidden abilities and access hard-to-find items, making it a must-have companion for any serious player. Exclusive to Black and White were a handful of new features that would rarely be used following the DS era. A seasonal cycle made the game more dynamic by changing up locations and encounter rates based on an in-game season. There are 4 seasons in total, matching the seasons of our real world. While primarily an aesthetic change in most areas, seasons did affect the forms of 2 new Pokemon, Deerling and Sawsbug. Each of the new Deer Pokemon came in a spring, summer, autumn, or winter form. Pokemon Musicals replaced the long-standing Pokemon Contest of previous games. Unlike Pokemon Contest, players were not judged based on Pokefood-related stats. Musicals offered a more straightforward experience. In round 1, players would dress up and accessorize their Pokemon, similar to a contest in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum worked. In the second round, a simple rhythm game is played showcasing the Pokemon's dancing. Winning rewarded the player with additional props for the dress-up section. On the battling side of things, 2 new types of battles were introduced: triple battles and rotational battles. Building off double battles, first introduced in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, triple battles see the player sending out 3 Pokemon to fight the opponent. This brings the total to 6 Pokemon on screen at once. Battles aren't too different from double battles, but they do require more planning, as the placement of the Pokemon determines who you can attack and who can attack you. Rotational battles also feature 3 vs 3 combat, but with only a singular active Pokemon. During your turn, you can choose to attack with your current active Pokemon, or you can rotate to one of the other 2 in battle. This switches the chosen Pokemon to the active spot and plays the turn out from there. Neither battling style was common in the region, and outside of some optional fights in Pokemon X and Y, triple and rotational battles have remained Unova exclusives. After completing the main story, players are given access to the Pokemon Transfer Lab. This feature lets players move Pokemon from Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, Heart Gold, or Soul Silver to Pokemon Black or White. This irreversible transfer replaces the POW Park of the previous generation. Unlike other transportation methods between generations, the Pokemon Transfer Lab forces you to play a short, touchscreen-based minigame to capture your already owned Pokemon. Future entries would not require any in-game activity to move Pokemon to newer games. Finally, there were some small improvements across the board to increase the overall quality of play. TMs, some of the most sought after items for anyone wanting to build their perfect team, became reusable, similar to HMs. This feature would remain a fixture in Pokemon games through the 3DS and into the Switch era until Scarlet and Violet made TMs breakable again. In-battle characters were changed from static to animated sprites, and certain towns and routes within Unova had dynamic music, changing the sound of your game depending on where you were and what time it was. The games even had minor DSi enhancements. Using the face cameras of the DSi, players could video chat with others using the Xtreaver function of the C Gear. The DSi's improved hardware also made some menus load faster. Black and White also had their own exclusive end-game areas. In Pokemon Black, you unlocked Black City, a post-game area with plenty of trainers to battle against. White offered the White Forest, which had exclusive Pokemon from past generations that were not available anywhere else in the game. Pokemon Black and White saw their first spin-off in April 2011, with Learn with Pokemon Typing Adventure. Sold bundled with a wireless keyboard, this educational game taught people how to type properly and quickly, no different from Sega's Typing of the Dead. Europe saw a localized version of the game in 2012, and Australia received one all the way in 2013, but Pokemon Typing Adventure would never be released in North America, making it one of the few Pokemon games translated into English that never released in the United States. In June of 2011, the Pokemon from Black and White made their debut on the Nintendo 3DS, with the downloadable application Pokédex 3D. This app featured all of the new Pokemon introduced in Black and White, minus the mythical Pokemon. The app offered up a look at 3D models of the Pokemon, as well as a basic blurb and information about the monster. A year later, the application received a paid downloadable update titled Pokédex 3D Pro. The update, which cost $14.99, included models of all Pokemon from generations 1 through 5, including new forms and the Generation 5 mythicals. In early 2012, Black and White saw their most impressive spin-off release, with Pokemon Conquest, a crossover between Pokemon and Nobunaga's Ambition. The late DS release featured turn-based strategy gameplay, similar to that of Fire Emblem or Final Fantasy Tactics. The game matched up legendary characters from the Nobunaga series with various Pokemon, and allowed you to recruit them to create an army strong enough to beat Nobunaga and save the Rensei region. The spin-off was met with strong reviews, but poor sales. This was likely driven by the spin-off's late release within the DS's lifespan. In early 2012, the 3DS was the premier Nintendo handheld, and the DS was largely being left behind. Game Freak, however, had one final release planned for the aging console. Part 2. Two powers combine. A new legend arises. Following the release of Pokemon Black and White, the massive team at Game Freak split into two groups once again. The first group, consisting of most of the developers, began work on new Pokemon games for the 3DS. Meanwhile, a small team led by Takao Uno began development on the final Pokemon games for the Nintendo DS. Uno was a 10-year veteran at Game Freak by this point. Primarily working in character and graphic design, he had leadership experience from his time as art director of Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. He also served as 3D art director of Pokemon Black and White. Several early decisions during the game's development colored the entire process. First was the decision to make the games on the DS. Despite the 3DS already being out, the Nintendo DS still had a massive install base, and the developers' familiarity with the system sped up the development process. Second was the decision to make full sequels rather than an upgraded third version like past generations. With the new games being sequels, developers were given new tools to showcase the Unova region in ways they hadn't been able to do before. Game Freak also wanted to shock players with the mix-up, as the series had never seen direct sequels before. As a bonus, Game Freak likely hoped that selling two games would be more profitable than a singular release. Set 2 years after the events of Black and White 2 followed a new protagonist who starts their journey in a previously unexplored corner of the Unova map. Like all Pokemon games, the player is given a starter Pokemon, a Pokédex, and a goal to defeat the 8 gym leaders and challenge the Pokemon League. Along the way, a revitalized Team Plasma under the leadership of a new character named Chorus would try to take over the region through various Pokemon-related acts of terrorism. The games would also include unlockable difficulties, allowing you to take on the adventure in easy or hard mode. Designers didn't stop there. They paid close attention to VGC tournaments, the officially sanctioned competitive format for Pokemon. They used the tournaments as a way to better balance the games, leading to a series of buffs and nerfs to certain Pokemon in the coming years. In February 2012, Pokemon Smash, the replacement for Pokemon Sunday, announced the two games. For Japanese players, they'd be able to play Pokemon Black and White 2 later that summer. Western fans wouldn't have to wait long, with the game set for a fall 2012 release, the shortest localization period of a Pokemon game to date. In April, a trailer for the games as well as the first in-game screenshots were released. The trailer showed a Unova region covered in ice, while introducing several new characters to us. More trailers would come out in the lead up to release, including a fully animated trailer featuring the new protagonist fighting the reformed Team Plasma. Pokemon Black and White 2 released in Japan on June 23, 2012 to great critical acclaim. Famitsu awarded the game a solid 36 out of 40, and over 2 million copies of the game were sold within the first 2 weeks, showcasing the staying power the Nintendo DS still had. English-speaking regions saw the game's release in October of 2012. Critical reception was just as strong as Black and White, if not better. IGN awarded the game a 9.6 out of 10, the highest rating they'd given to a Pokémon game since the original Game Boy era. Nintendo Life awarded the games a 9 out of 10, calling them the best Pokémon games to date. Worldwide sales were also strong. By January 2013, the duo had sold over 7 million units worldwide. Black and White 2 introduced several new features and improvements over the original releases. One of the earliest additions is Pokestar Studios, available after defeating the second gym. This new feature allowed players to act out various stories with their Pokemon that would be played back with additional effects to simulate the filmmaking process. The games also featured several new cities, from the coastal port of Burbank City to the mountainous desert of Lentimus Town. Players could also be awarded medals by the new character, the Medal Master. These were achievement-like rewards for completing certain tasks in-game related to catching Pokemon, battling, or linking the game with other players. A big addition to the game was the Pokemon World Tournament. This battling facility was encountered during the story mode, but its expansiveness was not unlocked until after you beat the game. In the post-game, you're able to battle gym leaders and champions from past games, including characters like Red, Giovanni, and even Juan from Pokemon Emerald. 3DS owners were given an extra bonus so long as they were willing to download a separate application. Selling for $2.99, you received an augmented reality game that functioned alongside Black and White 2 called the Pokemon Dream Radar. Using the 3DS's outer cameras and gyro controls, players could play a short minigame that would unlock rare Pokemon and items. Later levels unlocked new forms of Black and White's weather trio, Pokemon with hidden abilities, and even legendaries from previous games. Unfortunately, this game is no longer available for purchase via legal means with the shutdown of the Nintendo 3DS eShop. To transfer your catches and items to Black and White 2, a new feature called Unova Link was added to the game. Unova Link also had a feature called Memory Link. By linking with a copy of Black or White with the completed story mode, you could unlock additional cutscenes and post-game battles that were otherwise inaccessible. It also gave you access to In's Pokemon, wild Pokemon with unique battle animations, and other minor Easter eggs, like being able to see your Pokédex completion certificate or trophies from the battle subway in the player's room. The final feature of Unova Link was the key system. This unique unlock option allows you to unlock and save various difficulty options, version-exclusive cities, and the mystery door leading to the underground ruins. Unlocking every feature of Unova Link requires both copies of the game, leading to further justification on Game Freak's end to make 2 games rather than a single entry. In the decade since the 5th generation of Pokemon, new games have introduced new gimmicks and Pokemon forms that are designed to appeal to nostalgia. For many, Black and White are the last generation of games to offer a pure and straightforward experience, no different than the first journey many of us took in the 1990s. Moreover, Black, White, Black 2, and White 2 all feel like the most refined this experience has ever been, with sleek creature designs, an engaging narrative, fast-paced battles, and adventures that still feel fresh every time you hit the new game button. From a legacy standpoint, Black and White sold 15 million copies. This is slightly less than Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, but still good enough to be the 6th best-selling Nintendo DS game ever. Black and White 2 sold less, with only around 8.5 million copies sold. This was enough to make it the 12th best-selling Nintendo DS game. The decision to release 2 games paid off as well. Compared to Pokemon Platinum's singular release, Black and White 2 sold an additional 1.5 million copies. The 5th generation of Pokemon is one of my personal favorites and represents a time in my life where I too was maturing. I was a young adult during this time. I attended college, worked a full-time job, moved out on my own, and adopted my first pet. I was growing up, and with these games, it felt like Pokemon was growing up with me. I was sucked back into the world of Pokemon with these entries. I started buying the trading cards again, I became a competitive battler, and more than ever, I happily returned to Pokemon anytime life had me down. I had this magical world of creatures I could return to whenever I wanted. Black and White, and especially Black and White 2, are easy, cozy experiences that I love revisiting every couple of years. Current state of Pokemon, I don't think we'll be seeing remakes of Black and White or Black and White 3 anytime soon. Game Freak's focus is on creating new regions or reimagining old ones with the Legend series of games. However, that doesn't stop the company from referencing these classic titles. In 2023, the second half of the Pokémon Scarlet and Violet DLC, titled the Indigo Disc, saw players return to the Unova region for the first time in 11 years. In the DLC, the player is transferred to the Blueberry Academy. This offshore megastructure is said to be located somewhere in the waters of Unova. Inside the academy is the Terrarium, a man-made ecosystem of Pokémon with several areas serving as homages to the Unova region. Pokémon Go has also featured several black and white themed events. The current season is titled Dual Destiny. It focuses on Pokémon first introduced in black and white, and heavily features the Pokémon Zekrom and Reshiram. The event runs until March of 2025, ending with the Pokémon Go Tour Unova. Even the trading card game is getting back into the Gen 5 nostalgia. A currently unnamed set of cards, slated for release sometime in 2025, features the return of Owner's Pokémon. To tease this upcoming set, the Pokémon Company revealed N's Reshiram. And this doesn't even begin to cover the rest of the Pokémon spin-off games releasing on both mobile and Nintendo's main line of systems. Black and White's region, characters, story, and themes have left a lasting impact on the franchise. For many, myself included, Generation 5 is the peak of Pokémon design, and regardless of what Game Freak, Nintendo, or the Pokémon Company decide to do, we'll always have these classic games that we can return to. Thanks for watching. If you would like to support Double Dog, you can do so by following the link in the description for the Double Dog Patreon. Starting at only $1 a month, you can get early and ad-free access to Double Dog videos as soon as they're complete.